Okay, after EQing the kick and the snare, I want to address something and try and be real quick about it. I asked a question about low cut filters, high pass filters. I'm going to talk about it in the context of a low pass filter, but the same idea applies. I'm using this because it's the sub kick. I didn't talk about EQing the sub kick. The sub kick lives obviously primarily below 100, between 50 and 100. Is there any high frequency or mid frequency information in it? If I look at the input monitor, there is, a little bit jumping up there. But is it important to the sound? And as I bypass it, do we really hear anything? Not so much. But if you have 10 tracks of that little bit of high mid frequent information that's not part of the actual sound that you're trying to capture, it adds up, it compiles, it compounds, and that can muddy up your mix. So a lot of people were talking about using filters to cut bleed. Bleed is defined as instruments that are getting into microphones that you don't want. Kick drum getting into the snare mic, snare drum getting into the kick mic. If musicians are in the same room, the guitar amp getting into the snare mic, the drums getting into the guitar mic, that kind of thing. Noise is a bit different. The noise floor is, we could call it bleed because it's bleeding in, but the noise floor down here might be something like the air conditioner. You have windows in the room, so you hear a little bit of wind or hum from an air conditioner up on top of the roof. Luckily, we don't have that in this room, but they do down the hallway. So bleed and noise, slightly different. Yes, you can use a filter to affect the bleed. So here's an example. I can hear the snare drum. I don't hear the snare drum anymore, but I also don't hear the attack of the kick drum. Do I need to, given how much kick attack I have in the actual kick drum mic, the close mic? Maybe not. It's something to think about. Anyhow, I wanted to address that in terms of filters. And yes, you can use filters to gain a creative effect, but we're talking about them more in the context of a utility, how to maintain a clear mix. Next part of this is going to actually be gates, noise gates. And a noise gate is a utility, a processor in the dynamic section that turns a channel on and off. This is specifically about bleed and controlling bleed. So like a compressor or like a limiter, a noise gate turns the channel on and off based on the threshold that you set. So a sound has to go above that set point, that threshold, in order to open up the track. And there's a number of parameters that you control to get the sound the way that you want it. So we're going to start with the kick drum. Okay, and the Dyne 3 compressor comes in. Actually, I think I'll just go with this one here. The Dyne 3 compressor is under dynamics. Not the compressor, the expander gate. And turn it off so you can hear all that snare drum. And even with the default setting, you can hear the kick, the snare drum's gone. So let's talk about some of these parameters. So the threshold, like I talked about, and should be a familiar term, is when is the channel going to open up? So if I put the threshold all the way up to 0, nothing's opening it. Nothing's opening. If I lower it, it's not closing because any sound will open it up. So very, very important to tweak your threshold to the right point that it opens up for the instrument that you want to hear, in this instance the kick, and doesn't open up with the other instruments that you're trying to attenuate or make quieter. The attack, how quickly the gate's going to open. And this is really important because you can kind of see the higher the attack, it's so slow that even that kick drum's not opening it up. If you do it too fast, can't really say there's anything wrong with super fast, except that other things might open it up. So you want to tweak it to the right point for your instrument. Gates are used on vocals. Gates are used on guitar amps. Gates are used a lot on drums. However, sometimes controversial. Not everyone chooses to gate. It is an essential question. Is the bleed so much that we want to try and gate the drums? Is the genre of the song appropriate for having that super clear sound? So all things to consider. What's in your overhead mics? Will the overheads kind of help to fill out what can be a choppier sound from gates, which you'll start to understand as we tweak. All right, so the attack. How quickly does the gate... Actually, I don't really need this. How quickly does the gate open up? The hold. How long is the gate going to stay open? Also very important. And release. How quickly is the gate going to close? We're going to stick with those for the moment. So once it's open, we've set a threshold when to open, how quickly to open, how long to stay open. If we leave it open for 3 seconds, it's never closing. The snare drum's coming through. If we close it too quickly, we're cutting off the natural decay of the drum. So that for a second. If we look, easier to see it in a snare drum. If we look at this snare drum, there is the transient, the attack, but there's also this natural slope of decay, and we don't want to cut that off. So that's essentially what we're trying to mimic with the hold. So we allow the whole drum sound to come through. And how quickly do we close it with the release in order to come down quickly enough before the next sound comes through, the snare drum, but not so quickly that it cuts off the tail. So this is another thing to tweak. Ratio. Kind of for every decibel over, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, there's a little math involved. For every decibel over the threshold, how much is it going to be pushed down? More important to me is the range. Open this up a little bit more. So the range is, what is the noise floor? Do we want to turn it all the way off? Or I should say, not all the way off so that you can hear the bleed. We're turning it down so you'll still hear a little bit of bleed, but the bleed is softer. This can certainly help with that shaping of the sound of the attack, of the drum, because if we go all the way off, we could definitely be cutting off some of the drum. So I'd want to go back to my hold and adjust so I can really let that whole drum come through. Now, we've only been listening to a few drum hits. Are there going to be spots that the snare drum opens up? Yes. Are there going to be times that a cymbal crash opens up? Very likely. I haven't spent a lot of time tweaking this. Let's see actually and compare, because I did a little bit of before and after, where I ended up. Very different actually, isn't it? Let's listen to this other one, my pre. I like this second one better. I'm going to raise my range to get rid of some of that bleed. But I like to hear a little bit of it because it doesn't sound all concatenated and just super, super bright, or I mean tight. Snare drum. Oops, I have this open. I'm looking at the wrong one. So that's the snare drum, pre-gate. Here's the snare drum with my gate. Okay, so there's the kick and snare with their gates. Without. And what I want you to do is do this, solo your kick and snare when they're gated. I'm looking to hear pretty much just kick and snare, maybe with a minimal amount of bleed, mostly from the range as opposed to it breaking through the threshold.